Imagine this for a moment. A spacecraft that doesn't just launch, but actually has wings. One designed to fly back from orbit and land like, well, like an airplane. That was the incredible idea behind the space shuttle.
It really was breathtaking, wasn't it? And today on the deep dive, we're going to unpack that story, the history, the initial challenges. We've got a lot of great material, NASA resources, insights from people who actually worked on it.
Okay, let's get into it. Because, I mean, the shuttle wasn't just the next step after Apollo. It was fundamentally different.
Totally different. It took the raw power of a rocket launch, combined it with the controlled reentry of a capsule, but then added this unique glider landing capability. It was a real engineering marvel, aiming for something completely new in space access.
Yeah, marvel. Earlier spacecraft, they were mostly one-way trips, right? Use them once, maybe recover a capsule.
Exactly. But the shuttle was designed from the ground up to be reusable. Launched like a rocket, yes, but then maneuver during reentry, land on a runway. That concept, reusability, was potentially revolutionary.
But it wasn't just about the landing, was it? The ambitions were much broader. It had a whole job list once it got to orbit.
Oh, absolutely. A huge list. Things like precise rendezvous and docking, becoming a platform for science experiments right there in orbit.
And deploying satellites.
Deploying, yes, but also repairing them. Think Hubble, those servicing missions were only possible because of the shuttle. And then the really big one, building the International Space Station, piece by piece. No other vehicle has ever been asked to do quite that range of tasks.
So an incredibly complex machine. What were the main building blocks, the key parts of the system?
You basically had four main components working together. There was the orbiter itself, the part with the wings and the crew. Then the big external tank, the ET, holding all the fuel.
The orange one.
That's the one. Then you had the three space shuttle main engines, the SSMEs, at the back of the orbiter. And finally, those two big solid rocket boosters, the SRBs, strapped to the sides of the tank for liftoff.
And that configuration, with the orbiter, bolted to the side of the tank.
Mm-hmm.
That was new, right? Why do it that way?
Yeah, that side mount setup was really driven by the orbiter's design, especially those wings. The wings were essential for what's called cross-range capability during reentry.
Meaning it could maneuver side to side as it came down.
Exactly. It gave them much more flexibility in reaching a specific landing site, unlike a purely ballistic capsule that just comes straight down. But putting that big wing vehicle on the side, well, it created some massive aerodynamic and structural challenges during ascent. It wasn't simple.
I bet. And you said massive components.
Yeah.
What kind of weight are we talking about for the whole stack on the launch pad?
Fully loaded, ready to go. You're looking at roughly 2 million kilograms. That's about 4.4 million pounds.
Wow.
Yeah. And to get that off the ground and into orbit, you needed something like 35 million newtons of thrust, about 7.8 million pounds of force. Just immense power.
Okay, let's zoom in on the orbiter itself, that iconic winged part, where the astronauts were. How big was it, actually?
It was pretty substantial. Think airliner size. About 37 meters long, that's 122 feet, with a wingspan around 24 meters or 78 feet, roughly like a Boeing 737.
And the huge cargo area in the middle, the payload bay.
Immensely useful space. It was about 18 meters, 60 feet long, and 4.6 meters, 15 feet wide. Could carry up to maybe 29,000 kilograms, 65,000 pounds, depending on the mission's orbit.
And those big doors that opened up.
Right, the payload bay doors. They were actually made of this lightweight but very strong graphite epoxy composite, pretty advanced material for the time.
And inside, it wasn't just cargo, right? People lived and worked there.
Correct. You had the crew cabin split into two levels, the flight deck upstairs, the cockpit basically, and the mid-deck below.
That's where they had bunks and stuff.
Yeah, living quarters, galley, toilet, plus space for experiments, and the shuttle's main electronics in the avionics bays. The flight deck had amazing visibility, 6 windows forward, 2 overhead for docking, 2 looking back into the payload bay. Could fit up to 7 astronauts.
Keeping all that running in space, keeping the crew alive, takes power. How did they generate electricity? Solar panels?
No, not like the ISS. The orbiter used fuel cells. They combined super cold liquid hydrogen and oxygen to make electricity.
And water as a byproduct.
Exactly. Drinkable water, too. This system usually gave them about, say, 12 to 14 days of mission time. Later on, though, they developed a way to plug into the ISS for power.
Oh.
Yeah, the station-to-shuttle power transfer system started using it around 2006. That could stretch missions out to maybe 16 days.
That payload bay sounds like the key to its versatility.
Yeah.
You mentioned satellites, telescopes.
Yeah.
Any other major examples of what it carried up?
Oh, the list is huge. Earth observation satellites, communication satellites, interplanetary probes like Galileo to Jupiter, Magellan to Venus.
The great observatories.
Absolutely. Hubble, Compton Gamma Ray, Chandra X-ray, all deployed by the shuttle. And it wasn't just deploying things, it was a science lab itself, carrying modules like Space Lab, and of course the big one delivering almost all the pieces of the ISS.
Coming back through the atmosphere, the heat must have been incredible. How did it survive that?
That was the job of the thermal protection system, the TPS. Basically a heat shield covering the whole orbiter.
The black tiles.
The black tiles, yes, but also different materials in different areas.
Huh?
Some parts, like the wing leading edges and the nose, got way hotter, up to 1,600 degrees Celsius, that's 3,000 Fahrenheit. They used reinforced carbon there. Other areas used different tiles or thermal blankets. It was a complex, multi-layered system.
It's just incredible temperatures. And landing that thing, it was a glider, right? No engine power on approach.
Correct, an unpowered glider, which meant the commander had exactly one chance to land it perfectly.
One chance.
Yeah. And because of that, managing the orbiter's center of gravity was unbelievably critical for stability.
How critical?
We're talking about needing the center of gravity to be within a tiny imaginary box, maybe only 90 centimeters long and 5 centimeters wide and high. Just incredibly tight margins. They had to plan payload placement meticulously, sometimes even adding ballast, just to stay within that box for a safe landing.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about the other big pieces, that huge orange external tank. What was its job?
The ET was basically just a giant propellant tank, disposable. Its whole purpose was to hold the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen fuel for the 3 main engines during ascent.
And it fed them fuel at a high rate.
An incredible rate, something like 180,000 liters of liquid hydrogen per minute and 67,000 liters of liquid oxygen per minute in a very precise 6-to-1 ratio for the engines to work efficiently.
And the big white rockets on the sides, the solid rocket boosters, the SRBs, they provided the initial kick, right?
They provided most of the initial kick. About 83% of the total thrust at liftoff came from those 2 SRBs. Each one produced a massive 14.7 meganewtons of thrust. That's around 3.3 million pounds force each. Yeah. They burned for only about 2 minutes, getting the shuttle up to around 45 kilometers, then they separated. And remarkably, they were recovered from the ocean and reused. They were the biggest solid rocket motors flying at the time.
Okay, then the engines on the orbiter itself, the Space Shuttle main engines, the SSMEs, 3 of them, they seemed incredibly advanced.
They really were. Marvels of rocket engineering. They provided the thrust needed after the SRBs dropped off, all the way to orbit. Each one had a nozzle about 2.4 meters across.
How did they handle the heat?
They actually used some of the super cold liquid hydrogen fuel itself as coolant. It circulated through over 1,000 tiny tubes inside the nozzle wall. Very complex machinery inside, high-speed pumps, controllers, valves.
And their thrust wasn't constant, right? They throttled them.
That's right. Most of the time they ran at about 104.5% of their baseline power level. But during the phase of maximum aerodynamic pressure, what they called max Q, they'd throttle down to maybe 72% to reduce stress on the vehicle. And they'd throttle down again near the end of the burn to limit the G-forces on the crew to about 3 Gs. Interestingly, the crew could actually manually adjust the throttle within that range if needed.
And they could steer with them, too, by swiveling the engine.
Yes, they had gimbal capability. Each engine could pivot about 10.5 degrees up and down and 8.5 degrees side to side. That thrust vectoring was absolutely key for steering the whole stack during ascent.
I read about some kind of vibration issue they had during development, a rotary stability subsynchronous whirl. Sounds complicated.
It was a very specific, very tricky vibration problem in the engine's turbopumps. It took a lot of effort to solve. James Thompson Jr., who managed the engine project, talked about how a Rocketdyne engineer named Joe Stangler came up with this vortex theory.
A vortex?
Yeah, related to how the fuel was flowing. His idea was to put a small baffle, like a little paddle, in just the right spot to break up these problematic vortices. People were skeptical at first, apparently, but they tested it just before a big review, and it worked. A great example of finding a, well, maybe counterintuitive solution to a really tough engineering problem.
Getting these machines ready for flight, the ground processing must have been a huge operation.
Massive. They called it the flow. It was the whole process, from the orbiter landing, getting it checked out, refurbished, putting in the new payload, mating it with a new external tank. and refurbished SRBs and rolling it all out to the pad.
And they could process multiple shuttles at once.
Yeah, at Kennedy Space Center, they had the facility set up so different orbiters could be at different stages of the flow simultaneously. It was like a highly complex, very high-stakes assembly line. Each step had critical checks.
So incredibly detailed planning involved for every single mission.
Oh, absolutely. Mission guidelines, manuals, software development, and testing, unique for each flight, a detailed flight plan, strict tracking of every part, plus endless simulations and tests.
And turning it around after landing wasn't quick, was it?
Not at all. Post-mission processing took typically 4 to 5 months, over 750,000 work hours, millions of individual steps, inspections, repairs, replacing components, getting it ready for the next specific mission. The SRBs also needed extensive refurbishment after being fished out of the ocean.
Okay, so after all that work and the mission itself, it had to land. Where did they usually land?
The main spots in the U.S. were the dedicated shuttle landing facility at Kennedy Space Center in Florida and the dry lake bed runways at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Edwards was used a lot early on, right?
Yes, especially for the initial operational flights. Those huge lakebed runways offered a bit more margin for error while they were still gaining experience with landing. Weather was also a huge factor. STS-3 had to go to White Sands in New Mexico because Edwards was flooded. STS-7 was supposed to be the first KSC landing, but bad weather sent it to Edwards instead.
So the first KSC landing was later.
Yeah, STS-41B in 1984. They also had White Sands as a training site and a backup, plus several emergency landing sites overseas along the flight path, just in case. But remember, the commander only got one shot at landing that glider. No second chances.
Incredible pressure. What kind of help did they have to guide it in?
The main landing sites had visual aids, like runway lights and markings, similar to an airport, but also sophisticated electronic aids, like microwave landing systems for very precise guidance. Still, it came in much steeper and faster than an airplane around 350 kilometers per hour at touchdown.
And then a whole fleet rolled out.
Pretty much. As soon as it stopped, a convoy of about 25 vehicles and maybe 150 people would surround it. Safety checks, helping the crew out, cooling systems, and eventually towing it back to the processing facility.
It sounds like technology was at the heart of everything. How automated was the flying?
Very automated for its time. The Shuttle was the first spacecraft with a digital fly-by-wire flight control system. Almost everything was controlled by computers.
Computers, plural.
Yes, 5 identical general-purpose computers, GPCs, in the avionics bay.
5. Why so many?
Redundancy. 4 of them ran the primary flight software as a synchronized set. They constantly checked each other's calculations, like 440 times a second during ascent and re-entry. If one disagreed, the others could vote it out, essentially.
And the 5th one?
That ran completely separate backup software developed independently. A safety net in case there was a major undetected flaw in the primary software or a simultaneous failure in multiple primary computers.
Wow. And the software itself must have been incredibly complex.
Immensely. You had the core system software managing the computers and communication, and then the application software that handled the actual flying, navigation, system management, everything specific to the mission.
Were these powerful computers by today's standards?
Oh, not at all. The original IBM computers had only about 424 kilobytes of memory each. No hard drive. Everything had to be loaded before flight. They upgraded them in the early 90s, which helped, giving them more memory and speed.
Did they ever actually use that backup computer system in flight?
The backup flight system, or BFS, it ran in the background during ascent and re-entry, ready to take over if the crew manually switched to it. But remarkably, in the first 132 flights, they never actually needed to use the BFS to control the orbiter. Its existence, though, was a huge safety factor.
So redundancy was just built in everywhere.
Absolutely fundamental. The whole philosophy was fail operational, fail safe, meaning a single failure shouldn't stop the mission, and even a second failure in some critical systems shouldn't prevent a safe return. For re-entry, critical things like flight controls, computers, sensors often had 4 levels of redundancy. Others had 3.
And the software managed that, choosing the best data if a sensor failed.
Exactly. The software was smart enough to compare readings from redundant sensors, ignore any that seemed way off, and use the middle or average value from the ones that agreed. If more failed, it could adapt and rely on the remaining good ones. Very robust.
Okay, so it could fly itself pretty well, But it was also designed to be maneuverable in orbit, right, for docking and things like that.
Highly maneuverable. It used the Reaction Control System, or RCS. That was a set of 44 small thruster jets, front and back. They allowed for really fine control of the orbiter's attitude, its pointing direction, and small movements.
And for bigger orbital changes.
For that, it had the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS. Two larger engines in pods at the back, used for major burns like getting into the final orbit, changing orbits, or the deorbit burn to come home. The flight software, the digital autopilot, managed all this, letting the crew set very precise pointing requirements.
Rendezvous and docking.
Yeah.
Meeting up with other things in space. The shuttle did a lot of that. Sounds like something out of science fiction almost.
It really does. And it became the world's first sort of general-purpose rendezvous vehicle.
Okay.
It met up with everything from small satellites to the huge ISS. Interestingly, the original design wasn't even focused on direct docking. It was more about using the robotic arm.
How did a typical rendezvous work? It sounds complex.
It was, and it could take days. Usually started with ground control targeting the launch and initial burns to get the shuttle into an orbit near and slightly below the target. Then more burns, calculated by ground control, to close the distance.
Then the crew takes over.
Once they got closer, maybe within a few thousand meters, they'd switch to onboard targeting, using the shuttle's own radar and star trackers. The final phase, proximity operations, was usually manually flown by the commander and pilot. They'd use lasers, radar, visual cues, very carefully maneuvering for the final approach, grapple, or docking.
And that famous robotic arm was key for a lot of that, the Canadarm.
Absolutely. The Canadarm, provided by Canada, built by Spar Aerospace, a really sophisticated piece of gear, about 15 meters, 50 feet long, 6 joints like a human arm, controlled by the crew from the aft flight deck.
What could it do? Just grab things?
It could handle huge payloads up to 29,000 kilos, 65,000 pounds. It had a special hand, the end effector, to grab onto fixtures. It deployed satellites, retrieved them, moved big construction elements for the ISS.
And astronauts could ride on it.
Yeah, they could attach a foot restraint to the end, and the arm operator could move them around precisely for spacewalks, EVAs. After the Columbia accident, they also used it to hold a long boom with cameras to inspect the heat shield in orbit. Hugely important for ISS assembly.
Spacewalks, EVAs.
Yeah.
They became much more common and complex during the Shuttle era, didn't they?
Dramatically so. Before Shuttle, the U.S. had done, 38 EVAs total? The Shuttle program alone flew about 157 EVAs. And over 100 of those were specifically for building and maintaining the ISS.
And they weren't just floating around, they were doing serious work.
Absolutely. Real construction, complex repairs on satellites like Hubble, handling components weighing thousands of kilograms. It was a huge leap in capability.
What made that possible?
Few key things. The orbiter had its own built-in airlock. Then you had the spacesuit, the EMU, extravehicular mobility unit. It was basically a personal spacecraft.
Self-contained life support.
Totally. Provided oxygen, removed CO2, handled temperature extremes from like -73 to +177 Celsius, power, communications, computer control, all running at a lower pressure inside for flexibility. Plus, they developed a whole toolkit for working in space, specialized tools, tethers, work platforms. Usually 2 astronauts went out together.
So looking at its overall performance, it really was a jack-of-all-trades vehicle, wasn't it?
It truly was. Deploying satellites, servicing them, building the ISS, rotating crews, carrying supplies, and doing science itself.
What were some of the biggest things it deployed?
The heaviest was the Chandra X-ray Observatory, almost 23,000 kilograms. Hubble was lighter, around 13,600 kilos, but obviously hugely significant, especially with those 5 servicing missions. One limitation, though, was that the higher the orbit you wanted, the less payload you could carry. Below a certain altitude, the limit was actually how much weight the orbiter could safely land with, not how much it could launch.
And building the ISS, it's hard to imagine that happening without the shuttle.
Almost impossible. Starting with STS-88 launching the first U.S. module in 1998, 36 shuttle missions were dedicated to ISS assembly and logistics. Discovery, Atlantis, Endeavour were modified to dock directly with the station.
How much stuff did they carry on those flights?
A lot. Typically 12,000 to 18,000 kilos in the payload bay, plus another 3,000 to 4,000 kilos of supplies inside the crew cabin per mission. Over the whole program, the shuttle delivered something like 600,000 kilograms, structure, supplies, experiments, everything to the ISS. They even had to move the orbiter's airlock outside into the payload bay to make docking work.
And it wasn't just a delivery truck, it was a science lab, too.
Definitely. It could carry pressurized labs like Space Lab or Space Hab, where astronauts worked in a normal environment, or unpressurized instruments in the bay like radars or telescopes. It did microgravity research materials, science, fluid physics, biology, studied how humans adapt to space, hosted international experiments.
I remember the getaway specials.
Right. A cool program letting universities, companies, even individuals fly small, self-contained experiments relatively cheaply. Over 100 of those flew. And the shuttle was a stable platform for pointing instruments accurately, like for the Shuttle radar topography mission that mapped most of the Earth's land surface in incredible detail. It provided power and cooling for all these science payloads, too.
It sounded unbelievably capable, but also unbelievably complex, which must have meant risks,
Yeah.
challenges.
That's the crucial flip side. You had this incredibly complex machine where thousands, maybe millions of things had to go right on every single flight.
While only one thing needed to go wrong.
Exactly. That was the inherent risk. And things did go wrong, tragically. Weather was a constant issue, delaying launches and landings, and just the sheer scale of the national effort required for each flight. Thousands of people across multiple centers and companies, all needing to work perfectly together. It was an amazing achievement, but the complexity always carried that inherent danger.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. What an incredible journey exploring the Space Shuttle program. Just truly ambitious.
Monumental is the word, I think. It pushed engineering, it pushed human spaceflight. That reusable design, the versatility, it really changed the game, even with the challenges.
You've definitely covered a lot. The main parts, orbiter, ET, SRBs, those amazing SSMEs, the incredible ground operations, the flow, and all the things it could do, launching Hubble, building the station, the science.
This was the debut of a totally new kind of machine, a reusable space plane. I mean, think about the sheer guts involved, putting two astronauts on top of something that, well, hadn't really flown like this before.
Absolutely. It was a massive gamble, really, a
Yeah.
huge experiment. We were pushing into completely new territory with a vehicle meant to go up, come back, and do it again. That
Yeah.
was, well, that was stretching aerospace engineering right to its limits.
And the crew, John Young, the experienced commander, a real space veteran,
Right.
and Robert Crippen, the pilot, actually making his first trip to space on this mission.
Incredible pressure for a rookie flight.
So our aim today is to really get into the critical bits of STS-1. We'll cover the lead up, the worries, their training,
The prep work.
then the launch itself, what they did up in orbit, that fiery reentry, and crucially, what we learned from it all.
And for you listening, maybe you're not deep into the technical weeds of spaceflight. Don't worry.
Yeah, we'll break it down.
We want to make it clear why this mission was such a huge deal, what really mattered. By the end, you'll get why STS-1 was such a pivotal moment.
Okay, let's start with the atmosphere before the launch. Reading through the materials, the sheer number of meetings they had, it really jumps out.
It does. It shows how much scrutiny there was. And what's really interesting is how open they were about the unknowns.
Right.
Even the top engineers admitted, look, our test facilities have limits. The shuttle was just so big and complex. Wind tunnels, for example, they couldn't perfectly mimic the real flight conditions, especially, during ascent and reentry.
What couldn't they mimic, exactly?
Well, things like achieving the right Reynolds number, that's basically about how air flows around something, and getting it right is key for scaling up wind tunnel tests, and also fully simulating real gas dynamics, how superheated air behaves during reentry, which is incredibly complex.
Gotcha. So there were known gaps in the data even before they lit the engines.
Definitely. Which makes Chris Kraft's comment after they landed so perfect. He said, "We just got infinitely smarter."
Yeah. That says it all, doesn't it? It wasn't just a mission. It was like the biggest, most expensive lesson ever.
A live test flight, basically. And you have to remember, the shuttle program itself had been talked about and worked on for years.
Yeah.
Huge ambitions for reusable space travel.
The whole world was watching this one.
Oh, absolutely. Aware of the potential, but also, the risks. This was the first time humans flew this very different kind of spacecraft. The pressure was intense.
And preparing Young and Crippen for that, the training must have been unbelievably rigorous.
It had to be. Imagine strapping into something that's never flown with people. How do you even train for the completely unknown?
Yeah, what do you do?
Well, NASA threw everything at it. Exhaustive simulations, including practicing landings while still in the air, sort of simulated approaches,
Yeah.
and documentation. Oh, my goodness.
A mountain of it, I bet.
Yeah, the flight requirements document, operational flight profile, flight rules.
No.
thousands and thousands of pages trying to map out every possibility.
Trying to anticipate everything, even knowing space always throws curveballs.
Exactly. And speaking of risks, it's really telling that STS-1 actually had ejection seats.
Right. They took those out after the first 4 flights, didn't they?
They did,
Yeah.
which tells you a lot about how they viewed the risk level for this very first flight, particularly during launch and ascent, those really dynamic, high-energy phases.
Well, while they hoped for the best, they were definitely prepared for, well, not the best.
That's a good way to put it. Deep awareness of potential failures.
Okay, let's focus a bit more on the crew. Young, the commander, Crippen, the pilot. How did they split the work?
There's a very defined setup. Young, as commander, had the ultimate responsibility, for the mission, for safety. Crippen, as pilot, was his right-hand man, deeply involved in flying the vehicle, checking systems, navigation.
This is during ascent, for example.
They'd both be glued to the ascent checklist, calling out system statuses, verifying steps. Each had very specific tasks. They weren't just passengers.
Not at all. Active pilots the whole way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Their training covered everything. Launch procedures, tricky maneuvers in orbit, knowing all the shuttle systems inside and out, and then that incredibly demanding re-entry and landing.
And they had that flight data file, right? Like their main guidebook in the cockpit.
Exactly. Full of checklists, ascent, entry, the orbit pocket checklist for day-to-day stuff. It was their lifeline, step-by-step instructions for almost everything.
And their time in orbit, though short, was packed, too. You mentioned the crew activity plan.
Yeah, that laid out their schedule. The main job up there was basically ringing out the orbiter, checking its systems.
Like what specifically?
Things like testing the flight control system with specific maneuvers, making sure the power systems were good, doing water dumps.
Water dumps?
Yeah, venting excess water produced by the fuel cells.
Right.
Also checking communications, the computers, the data processing system, or DPS. They ran it through its paces.
And I read they were even looking out the windows, checking the outside of the shuttle.
That's right. Visual inspections, looking for any damage, anything unusual, especially on those thermal tiles. Plus, they were using all the navigation gear, star trackers, inertial measurement units, the optical alignment sight, to keep track of exactly where they were and how they were oriented.
So not much science on this flight. More like a shakedown cruise.
Pretty much. STS-1 was fundamentally a flight test, making sure the machine worked as designed. They were even doing detailed consumables analysis, tracking how much power, water, oxygen they were using.
Okay, so after just over 2 days of that intense checkout,
Right. Relatively short.
came the big one,
Okay.
re-entry. How did that kick off?
It starts with the deorbit burn, firing the orbital maneuvering system, the OMS engines, just enough to slow down and start falling back to Earth.
A critical moment. Get that wrong in.
And you're not coming home right. After the burn, they had to maneuver the shuttle into the entry attitude belly first, basically. So the heat shield takes the heat.
And that point where it hits the atmosphere, the entry interface, traveling at thousands of miles per hour, must have been intense.
Incredibly intense and incredibly critical. There's a fascinating NASA report that reconstructs the entire entry path.
Oh, yeah. What did they use for that?
They use ground radar, S-band, and C-band, tracking it precisely. Plus, all the data from the shuttle's own inertial measurement units. They tracked it from about 183 kilometers up all the way down to the runway.
Wow. And they used some fancy math to figure it all out. You mentioned a filter algorithm.
Yeah, a weighted least squares batch filter.
Yeah.
It's a way to get the best estimate of the shuttle's position, speed, and orientation, what they call inertial parameter estimation. Super important for understanding how it flew.
Okay.
They even refined the altitude and speed data using artificial altimeter and Doppler data during the rollout on the runway. All this analysis was vital for understanding the aerothermodynamics.
Which is?
Basically how the air and heat interact with the shuttle at those crazy speeds. Understanding the heat load, the pressures, making sure the design held up.
The forces involved are just hard to wrap your head around. And then finally, the glide down to landing and Crippen's famous line.
Yeah, the reminder about the landing gear. I hope I remember to put the gear down. It just shows that human element, right? Even in this high-tech marvel.
A bit of gallows humor, maybe?
Maybe. But they nailed the landing at Edwards Air Force Base. A picture-perfect end to a very, very risky test flight.
But it wasn't really over then, was it? The work continued on the ground.
Not by a long shot. Once Columbia was safe, the big job was retrieving all that flight data. Hours and hours of sensor readings, computer logs.
Gold dust for the engineers.
Absolutely. And the crew had their biomedical checkups, of course. But one really telling document is the STS-1 anomaly list.
Anomalies. Problems.
Well, yeah, sort of. It listed over 60 instances where the orbiter didn't perform exactly as expected. Not necessarily dangerous failures, but glitches, unexpected readings, things like that.
Over 60 on the first flight.
Yep. And finding those was a huge part of the learning process. It could be anything from a sensor acting up to a minor system hiccup.
Really underscores that infinitely smarter quote again. They learned so much from what didn't go perfectly.
Exactly. And all that fed into massive post-flight reports, like the Integrated Systems Evaluation Report, the Orbiter Final Mission Report. They went over everything with a fine-tooth comb.
Including checking the heat shield tiles for damage.
Oh, yeah. Assessing damage from debris strikes during launch was a big focus right from the start. That data, all the anomaly reports, the performance analysis, it all directly impacted how they flew the next missions.
So looking back, STS-1 was way more than just getting up and down. It was this incredibly brave first step and a massive data haul.
Couldn't have said it better. It was a resounding success because it proved the concept and gave them the foundation for the whole shuttle era.
Yeah, without STS-1, you don't get the Hubble deployment, the ISS construction.
Exactly. The knowledge gained was essential. It paved the way for decades of exploration and science that relied on the shuttle. Its importance is just immense.
We're going to explore the immediate reactions after landing, how the public and politicians viewed it, the support under Reagan, the budget reality, some key NASA decisions, and ultimately how this one flight really set the stage for the next 30 years. We're drawing on NASA budgets from the early 80s, Space Communications Program reports, congressional hearings, public perception analyses, and, of course, the STS-1 mission details themselves. Just a quick refresher. STS-1, first orbital flight of the shuttle, April 12th to 14th, 1981, John Young and Robert Crippen on board. The main goal, prove the whole system worked. Launch to landing, a test flight, really.
Right. And what jumps out from the sources is that this test flight, well, it was a mix. Clear successes, absolutely, but also some, let's say, significant and pretty unexpected issues that kind of foreshadowed things to come.
Exactly. The headlines scream success. But when you dig into those post-flight reports, it gets more complex. Even while they were up there, the crew spotted problems during visual checks. Missing heat shield tiles, right, around the OMS RCS pods.
That's right. And John Young also noted a couple of tiles on the nose looked pretty badly damaged. It was definitely noticed in orbit.
And here's a wild part I found in the sources. Apparently, the U.S. Air Force secretly used a KH-11 spy satellite.
Oh, yeah, the Kennan satellite.
To take pictures of Columbia in orbit to check the tile damage.
Absolutely. It was incredibly classified at the time, codenamed Blue Cube. They actually had to adjust the STS-1 launch window slightly to make sure the satellite was in the right place at the right time. Very few people at NASA even knew.
Wow, that's amazing. And those images confirmed the damage wasn't, like, immediately catastrophic.
Correct. They confirmed damage, but it wasn't considered an imminent threat to safe return. Post-flight inspection found about 16 tiles near one OMS pod were actually lost during ascent. But the challenges weren't over. Re-entry had its own surprises.
Yeah, tell us about that. The aerodynamics weren't quite right.
Not quite. The computer models used to predict the center of pressure. They were based on what's called an ideal gas model, a simplification.
Okay, so like theory versus messy reality at Mach 25.
Pretty much. The real conditions meant the actual center of pressure was different, so the flight computer had to compensate by extending the body flap, that big control surface underneath, much more than planned. 16 degrees instead of the expected 8 or 9.
16 degrees, that's a big difference. And there was more, right? Unexpected rolling during maneuvers.
Exactly. When they did the first roll maneuver, firing the yaw RCS jets, the small thrusters caused these unexpectedly large rolling moments. It pushed the orbiter into higher side slip angles, up to 4 degrees, which is about double what they predicted. The computer was definitely earning its keep.
Constantly adjusting. And that overpressure wave from the SRBs at launch, that had downstream effects too.
It really did. Very concerning ones, actually. It caused a support strut for the forward RCS oxidizer tank to fail. And maybe even more alarming, it pushed the body flap to such an angle that it could have potentially ruptured the hydraulic lines.
Ruptured the hydraulics, that would mean.
Loss of control during descent. John Young later said if they'd known the risk, they would have considered ejecting. It really highlights how close the margins were.
Sobering. And even the heat shield itself took some hits during re-entry, not just the tiles lost on ascent.
Correct. There was a strake plate near the external tank door latch. It showed signs of melting, of distortion from extreme heat. Investigators figured out an improperly installed tile nearby allowed hot gas to impinge on it, Just shows how every single piece mattered.
Every tile, every gap filler. And there was something else discovered after landing, something significant in the landing gear.
Yeah, this is quite something. A small bit of protruding tile gap filler channeled superheated gas directly into the right main landing gear, well, during reentry. It caused quite a bit of damage inside, even buckled the gear door slightly. It was documented in the post-flight report, but interestingly, the crew wasn't told about it at the time.
They weren't told. Imagine finding that out later.
Right, finding out you landed with potentially compromised gear, it just underlines the risks and the steep learning curve they were on.
Absolutely. So, despite all these, behind-the-scenes technical dramas, how did the public and the politicians react? What was this feeling?
Well, looking broadly, the shuttle program, starting right from STS-1, became this incredibly potent symbol. Even after the tragedies later on, sources looking at international views show people worldwide saw the shuttle as synonymous with American technological power, right up there with military or economic might. It was a projection of excellence.
A global icon, basically. And that initial success of STS-1, landing safely after all that anticipation, must have created a huge wave of public enthusiasm here, a sense of pride.
Oh, definitely. Maybe not quite the same geopolitical urgency as Apollo, but there was absolutely a surge of national pride and excitement. People felt America was still leading the way in something big and bold. And politically, that initial positive buzz was crucial. It helped build the foundation for the continued support and, importantly, the funding the program needed going forward.
Which brings us neatly to the Reagan administration. His presidency started right as the shuttle was getting going operationally. How did they view it?
The Reagan Library archives make it pretty clear. The administration was focused on national strength, technological advancement. The shuttle fit perfectly into that narrative. Remember, Reagan called for a space station in his '84 State of the Union. The shuttle wasn't just a vehicle. It was seen as the enabler for bigger things in space, like building that station.
So it was integral to their vision, and that translated into budget support. Did the money follow the vision?
It certainly seems so. Based on the budget documents and congressional authorizations from that time, the shuttle was consistently prioritized. Fiscal year '83 appropriations, for instance, the House committee proposed nearly $1.8 billion just for the shuttle program. That's serious money, especially back then.
Where 1.8 billion, and the focus was shifting, right? From STS-1 being R&D, a test, to making the shuttle an operational system.
Exactly. Congressional reviews explicitly called that transition NASA's highest priority in FY '83. But that heavy investment in the shuttle has ripple effects. The sources show that budget constraints meant cuts elsewhere in NASA. Some worried this focus was unbalancing the overall space program.
A classic budget squeeze. Pouring resources into one big project impacts others. And the whole cost-effectiveness question started coming up too, didn't it? Especially compared to traditional rockets.
That became a major ongoing debate. The expendable launch vehicles, the ELVs, often proved cheaper and more flexible for launching satellites and uncrewed probes. NASA's initial idea of having the shuttle launch everything crewed and uncrewed just didn't pan out economically. They had to walk that back eventually.
So the promise of cheap routine access didn't quite materialize as hoped, and this affected plans for things like planetary missions using the shuttle, getting probes to Jupiter, for example.
Yes, precisely. Developing the powerful upper stages needed like Centaur or the IUS to launch from the shuttle's cargo bay faced all sorts of budget ups and downs. There were debates about cost, about technical suitability for missions like Galileo to Jupiter or the Ulysses solar probe. These budget and planning inconsistencies definitely impacted deep space science.
It really paints a picture of complex trade-offs, technological ambition versus the hard realities of funding. And that leads into NASA's own management decisions around this huge program.
Well, the biggest decision was just proceeding with something so complex and, frankly, risky. But looking deeper, we see the beginnings of something the Columbia Accident Investigation Board later called normalization of deviance, particularly with the thermal tiles. STS-1 flew with known missing tiles. Over time, minor tile damage started to be seen as almost routine, an acceptable risk. That mindset had tragic consequences down the road.
Normalization of deviance. That's a chilling phrase. Accepting small flaws until they add up to disaster, and NASA was constantly juggling these risks, right? Analyzing potential failures.
Constantly. Later mission documents, like for STS-133, detail extensive risk analyses, debris strikes, engine failures, thermal protection system issues. They were always aware of the dangers, even as flights became more routine.
And those upper stages we mentioned, the planning for those kept shifting in the early '80s.
Yes. The sources show changes in plans for Galileo and Ulysses, upper stages between 81 and 83. A mix of technical hurdles and, again, those budget pressures we talked about, it made long-term planning very difficult. And the budget crunch even pushed NASA to look at privatizing some programs, like the Landsat Earth observation satellites. The Space Communications Program report mentions this assessment. It shows they were exploring all options to manage costs.
So STS-1 wasn't just a flight. It kicked off this whole era defined by incredible technology, yes, but also by intense political interest, persistent budget challenges, and really critical management choices. Which brings us to the big question. How did STS-1, this first flight with all its triumphs and troubles, shape the next 30 years?
Fundamentally, it proved the concept. A reusable spacecraft could go to orbit and land. That basic success underpinned everything that followed over 130 missions. For 3 decades, the shuttle was America's way to get humans to space. It built the ISS, deployed Hubble, launched countless satellites, enabled so much science.
The workhorse, essentially. And those early problems, the tiles, aerodynamics, they weren't ignored. They led to changes.
Absolutely. They directly informed design tweaks and changes to how missions were flown. That overpressure issue at launch. It led to improvements in the sound suppression system at the launch pad to reduce vibrations. Lessons learned were applied.
And the tragedies, Challenger and Columbia, while horrific, are also part of this lineage, tracing back to STS-1.
In a way, yes. They forced massive safety reviews and fundamental shifts in how NASA managed risk. Many of those changes were responses to systemic issues and lessons learned, or perhaps not fully learned, throughout the program's entire history, which began with STS-1's calculated gamble.
And the shuttle itself as an idea, as an image that lasted, didn't it? Even with the debates.
It really did. From STS-1 onward, it was iconic. It helped maintain public and political interest in human spaceflight, even when cost effectiveness was questioned. It kept space exploration in the public eye, and ultimately, all that experience, the successes, the failures, the high operating costs, directly influence what came next. You see the push for lower costs and more reusability in today's commercial space ventures. The shuttle's legacy, its lessons are baked into modern spaceflight.
So STS-1, definitely a high-stakes gamble. Our sources show this complex picture: immediate technical challenges, political backing, budget battles, early management choices. Its successes and those initial problems really did set the course for the shuttle era's triumphs and tragedies, shaping spaceflight for decades. And as some analyses point out, the debate over whether it was ultimately a policy success, that continues today.
Which really leads to a final thought for you listening. Knowing what we've discussed about STS-1, its hidden issues, its long-term consequences, how do you evaluate that original decision to build the shuttle? And maybe more pointedly, what single lesson from that very first flight, STS-1, do you think echoes most strongly in space exploration today?
Something to definitely think about.